Hello and welcome to the IRP podcast Peace Matters, a podcast that deals with international relations and geopolitics. My name is Stefanie Fenkert. I am the director of the International Institute for Peace. In light of the upcoming European Union parliamentary elections, the IRP is holding a series of podcasts dealing with European affairs. And today I'm speaking with Péter Krekó and Paul Schmidt about the Orbanization of Europe. Péter Krekó is a political scientist and he's also the director of the Political Capital Institute in Budapest, and he is also a fellow at the Rijeka University of International Advanced Studies. Paul Schmidt is the General Secretary of the Austrian Society for International European Politics. I hope you find this episode interesting. Péter, we are going to face European Union elections this June, and there are also municipality elections in Hungary. However, we do think that especially in these European parliamentary elections that we're going to see a shift more towards right-wing parties. So my question would be, what do you think of that? I mean, how do you see the future of the European Union in this specific context from an Hungarian point of view?
Yes, very important question. I think the nature of big multinational institutions is that they don't change quickly. So anyone who expects an immediate U-turn in EU policies as a result of the growing proportion of Eurosceptic and far-right parties in the European Parliament, I think are rather wrong. We already see some policy shift in some areas, for example, in green issues, for example, in migration-related issues. In the current European Parliament, more cooperation, for example, with the European People's Party and ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformist group, who's practically headed by Giorgia Meloni, de facto. But I think we can see a shift in the mood in the European Union towards a bit more nativist, towards a bit more anti-immigration, towards a bit more, I would say, even anti-green direction. And there is this war fatigue that we can see, and it will definitely manifest on the elections. I don't think, though, that it will dramatically change the European Union. And the most important thing by the end of the day is that which governments are leading the nation states, because they vote for in the European Council, which is still far the most important decision-making body of the European Union. And yes, there are some Eurosceptic nationalist parties on power already, in Italy, for example, or in Slovakia, and they are in minority, they are in coalition partners in some other countries, or supporting the government like in Sweden. But so far I haven't seen it just changes the things. And I think that, yeah, I'm coming from Hungary, a country that plays rather destructive role in the EU decision-making generally, but I don't even think that Hungary have been really able to change the direction of EU policy making so far. So for that reason, I would say that yes, far-right parties will be on the rise in this election, but we shouldn't expect some dramatic deep changes in EU decision making.
Paul, of what you just heard, actually the same question to you. European Union parliamentary elections, Peter already mentioned that the most important body still obviously is the Council, but nevertheless we do think that there is going to be a shift a little bit more to the conservative right-wing fractions. Why do you think actually this is the case? Because I do think this is also something we need to address, why this is the case. We can later then also speak a little bit about the foreign policy, Russian influence, Chinese influence, and all those issues, but more or less the same question, what do you expect from the outcome of the parliamentary elections now this June?
I think I agree with the assessment of Peter very much. We will see a lack of members for the European Parliament on the liberal side as well as on the green side. They will lose big time, I think. There's a lot of pressure on them, while at the center, at the core of at the integrational core of the European Parliament, we more or less have quite a stable situation for the European People's Party and the Socialists. And on the right-wing side, well, there will be big gains, that's true. Again, like in 2019, 2024, we'll need at least a three-party coalition for the working program and the strategic program for the next European Commission, and of course for decision-taking on who is in charge of what on a European level. So the big posts, the big European leaders that will be elected. The European parliamentary elections are just one step for nationalist parties. They are not the big objective. The big objective is, of course, as they are nationalist parties, to win in national elections, then move towards the governments, and then play a role on a European level in the Council of the European Union, where the member states have the big say. So that is, I think, what we're going to see. And on your question on what are the reasons for this development, there are many reasons, of course. There are different reasons between member states, but on the other hand, there are also developments which they have in common, of course. One of the main reasons is the sense of instability, insecurity, and mistrust towards established political parties of the center. So the need to look for alternatives, the wish to vote against those which are in power, basically. It has to do, of course, with the geopolitical situation and with a situation where we have many different challenges and big questions in parallel. From war and peace to high inflation and the question of quality of life and living standards, to still the consequences of the corona crisis, the way we deal with discussing European issues, whether we shy away or we play the blame game and use the European Union as a scapegoat. And that is also something where I think the more established political parties of the center of our societies are to blame, because they shy away from getting into the ring and discussing European issues, while they leave a lot of space to very critical to anti-European parties, because there's still this very old feeling that some of the actors feel that you cannot win elections with European issues, so you rather not make a statement. And I think that's quite wrong. I mean, we have also seen proof that if you really believe in what you say, and if you argue and explain what is going on, you can actually solve or create a positive public opinion on European affairs. And I mean, energy crisis, migration challenge, there's so many issues on the table. Some of them are exaggerated in order to create a climate which is negative. Some political parties are much more interested in the problem than in the solution, and that's where you have all the ingredients for a nationalistic comeback. And that's what we see now in the opinion polls, and maybe also in the results for the European elections. And then there's probably more to come when it comes to national elections.
Yeah. Peter, what you just heard also, it was a little bit, you talked about inflation and all those reasons. Obviously, COVID also played a role. But Hungary always had a specific role within the European Union. I would say mostly a spoiler, the role of being a spoiler when it comes to many issues concerning foreign policies. There is anonymity in the Council normally asked for, and Hungary very often uses its veto power, not only for Russia and the sanction issue, but also for China. So maybe you can just reflect a little bit on why this Eurosceptical Hungary, or let's call it maybe why Orban is a Eurosceptical, and then why he plays this Russian and Chinese card, and what this actually means then for the unity of the European Union when it comes to foreign policies in general.
Yes, thank you. And I would say that just to avoid overgeneralizations, we have to make it clear at the very beginning that the pro-Russian and pro-Chinese stance of Orban, I would not say that it's absolutely a common denominator among Eurosceptic parties. The group where Orban is heading to right now, or wishes to enter, European conservatives and reformists, this is one of the most hawkish group against Russia and highly supportive towards Ukraine, especially if we think about the Polish delegation, which is law and justice, which is very, I would say, critical of Russia, but also Giorgia Meloni, surprisingly to many, have rather also become a hawk in this issue. And also in the question of China, I think most of the Eurosceptic parties are rather more critical and sometimes also following a bit of, let's say, Trumpian line on the, let's say, cultural war that is coming and the Chinese danger on our economies, but also on our cultures as well. And Orban runs this pro-Russian, pro-Chinese policy. Of course, it's not unique in the European Union. We at Political Capital did an analysis of the foreign policy votes in the European Parliament. What we found is that Russia-friendly and China-friendly votes are the most frequent on the far left group, the left, and the identity and democracy group, the far right group. So I think this kind of logic that the West is rotten. Therefore, if you are betting for the future, you have to team up with the enemies of the West. So, and it's, they do not put it that bluntly, but this is, I think, the underlying motive. Orban made it crystal clear many, many times that he does not believe that the Western liberal democracies are very prosperous. He thinks practically that the West, as it is over, that NATO and the EU will be over. He talks about it quite openly, and it might be a bit of wishful thinking as well, but this is how he predicts the future. And if you predict the future this way, and I think it's a wrong prediction, but it doesn't matter, if they think it's right, then to a certain extent it looks logical that they move towards Russia, towards China. But of course, beyond this pragmatic, beyond this kind of geopolitical long-term considerations and philosophical considerations and ambivalence towards liberal democracies, you also have a big chunk of pragmatism. Let's take a look at how government-closed companies in Hungary are benefiting from huge Russian and Chinese infrastructure projects, energy projects, and you name it, mostly, for example, from Russian and Chinese loans, which means that finally these are the taxpayers who have to pay these big businesses, but private persons and groups close to the government are benefiting from that big time. So we always have to keep it in mind that, especially for China, but still also for Russia, these money traps are still the most successful, I would say, and most useful tool to domesticate players in the European Union and turn them in their favor.
If I may jump in, I think in terms of media presence, Orban is quite strong, but on a European level, when it comes to real politics, he's very much sidelined and isolated, completely isolated, I would say. Look at the Fidesz MEPs in the European Parliament, which do not belong to any political group. And even within the political groups of the nationalists, there's so much heterogeneity. You have mentioned some of the examples, in particular on migration and Russia, but also sometimes on China, that they cannot really join forces. No? He might want to present himself as a big spoiler, Orban, but what has he spoiled? What has he avoided, in fact? I mean, we've seen 12 waves of sanctions that were decided unanimously. We've seen a midterm review of the EU financial budget with an extra 50 billion for Ukraine, which was decided unanimously. still a lot of funding is withheld because Orban's government doesn't abide to the criteria and doesn't stick to the rule of law. So, in fact, in terms of real politics, he's completely sidelined and has no influence whatsoever, taking now aside the media issue. And it's not only always about unanimous decisions, in fact. I mean, you look at the issues which we have with the decision-making on the European nature restoration law, where you need a qualified majority, where there was an agreement, in fact, between the Council and the European Parliament. The European Parliament voted then in favor, and there was the formal decision-making of the Council, which then all of a sudden changed its tune and changed its position. It has not changed its position all over, but Slovakia and Hungary changed their position, even if the Fidesz members of the European Parliament in the European Parliament voted in favor. But they changed their positions, and they are now blocking, and Austria is not playing a very prestigious role here, once again, but the two of them have changed sides, and that's why we fulfilled the country criteria with more or less 18 countries in favor, but we don't have the population criteria, where we are more or less at 63%, and we need to pass the 65 threshold. So it's not always about unanimity, but in fact, I would say, in the end, I mean, the European integration is the art of compromise. In the end, we reach an agreement, pressure will be so high that one of those countries will actually agree. And that's what we've seen before. And that's why I would say that also when it comes to the formation of the new European Commission, enlargement has gained so much of importance because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine that it's a very safe bet that there will be not a commissioner from Hungary again in charge of EU enlargement.
I would like to talk about enlargement a little bit maybe later, because I do agree that when it comes to specific policies, Orban might not have been that much of a spoiler. But if you look maybe at all those, like valuations, and since you mentioned enlargement, I do think that many other countries are very skeptical to enlarge if we do not also discuss then a treaty change, because they do have the feeling that if there are more people on the table, it's going to be even more difficult to have decisions when it comes to foreign policy issues. And I think I remember it was in 2019 that the European Union prepared a statement against this new Chinese law when it came to Hong Kong, the human rights issue, and Hungary actually vetoed that. So this kind of sense, so even if it's not most probably not only specific policies, but they do shift kind of the way the European Union wants to act as let's call it an actor, which is actually in favor of all those liberal democratic values, as we might call it, how they are also defined in Article 2 of the treaty. I do think that Hungary is a very huge spoiler there, and I would like just to hear your comments on this, and then later I would also like to ask a little bit about enlargement.
Yeah, honestly, I totally agree that Orban is more of a shaman in European politics and international politics, and an ideological role model than someone who really makes history by changing the decisions. And yes, he would like to act like a spoiler many times, and also he would like to seem to be a spoiler many times. But if we take a look at the real substantial vetoes he had, usually the most important decisions, even in foreign policy, even the ones he highly disagree with rhetorically, he does not veto them. For example, there were some blocking at the first place of some Belarus-related sanctions, but then Hungary supported them. Yet there were a lot of criticism of Russia-related sanctions, but most of them were supported by Hungary. They could soften some with taking off a few people from the sanctions list, but it does not really spoil the whole thing. If we talk about the Euro-Atlantic cooperation more general, they delayed a bit the accession of Finland and Sweden a bit more to NATO, but finally they passed it. In foreign policy, when there was one, I would say it was just a Mickey Mouse package of sanctions against Xinjiang officials because of the Uyghur, I would say, genocide in China. And when it comes to resolutions, Hungary usually vetoing them. When it came to this sanction package that Hungary highly disagreed with, they finally supported it because they know that which are the more important decisions, and they know that if they keep blocking them repeatedly, and when it came to the budget, I think last time Orban was pulled in the corner, and all the other member states told them that this is no, you can't go further. You cannot get any more concessions. You just have to stand in the line. And he stood in the line. So I think he still rationally calculates what are the costs and benefits. And if other EU member states are rather united in making him clear that there are limits to his outlierism, I think it can work. And in that respect, I think these wishes of Orban that Robert Fico will be his man, and he have simply not been materialized. And that's where I think this counter-indicator role of Orban becomes more important. If you pay the spoiler, who wants to team up with you? Slovakia wants to also be at the most important decision-making bodies. If you team up with Orban, it's not your best chance. And I would also raise the question, who would like to have a spoiler in their European parliamentary group? Do you want a troublemaker, a constant troublemaker among your ranks to destroy the group from the inside? So I think Orban a bit overplayed the spoiler role. His spoiler role is not that important as it appears, but it already does him a lot of damage in the Euro-Atlantic world.
Yeah. And I would also add that, Fico is in a different position. Okay, Slovakia is a Euro country, and he has a more balanced, I think, still compared to Orban, a much more balanced approach to Ukraine
exactly.
than the Hungarian government. And in fact, the European Parliament is a working parliament. Okay, there you need to discuss, negotiate laws, find compromises, move on with European integration, define rules for the whole European Union. And you have to make a decision. Do you want to block everything? Do you want to have no role whatsoever? Do you want to send there people who just have a high salary but can't do anything? Or do you want to contribute in terms of content and facts and information and political work and legislative work? Okay, I think that's a decision you have to make. And for Fico and others, do you want to lose all your credibility and be sent out to go for coffee in order to have the European Council reach unanimity on enlargement? The whole picture was something which was, for us as analysts, interesting to watch, because he was actually sent out of the room.
Yeah.
When the real decisions are taken, Hungary is sent out of the room to go for coffee. Imagine the PR catastrophe there. I think that's nothing you really want to wish for, despite all the professional marketing and the publicity responses there. But to your question regarding enlargement and treaty change, I think if we wait for treaty change, there will be no enlargement whatsoever. I think there's a geopolitical imperative now to advance with the process. What we've seen so far is symbolic acts, which should not be underestimated. I think they were important because you give moral support, political support, orientation. But when it comes to the real nitty-gritty moment of negotiating, it's not a negotiation actually, of proceeding, advancing with the process of enlargement, then it becomes much more political, and the vested national interests come much more to the surface, and it will be more difficult. But and enlargement is not only about geopolitics; it's very much about also the social and economic dimension. In fact, okay, and it's true that it's also about the functionality and the functioning of the institutions, and there needs to be a reform of the institutions. But you can reform the working of the European Union without treaty reform. If you have political will and the political strength to do this, there's a lot you can do. Also moving from unanimity in in foreign security issues to qualified majority, sending colleagues for coffee, more of an innovative action, or even constructive abstention. There are ways to move forward without treaty change. If you want to change the treaty and wait for ratification, there will be no enlargement. Reform will already be difficult enough, I think, for member states to actually give green light to that, because unanimity is, for many member states, perceived as being very crucial. On the other hand, they always expect the European Union and themselves to move faster. So there's a contradiction here in terms, actually. So enlargement will advance. It will become more difficult. We need the outside pressure to advance more rapidly, and we will see where the process will lead us. I think it's still open what the result will be, and when we can actually enlarge, when the candidates will be ready and the European Union will be ready. But if the geopolitical escalation continues in that way, I would say we will see an enlargement rather sooner than later.
I do have a follow-up question, because I do think that treaty change is a very, very difficult topic, and it is not really addressed because nobody actually thinks that it's going to happen. On the other hand, I don't really see a real enlargement, a full enlargement happening without a treaty change, specifically for the reasons that we already talked before, because countries are afraid that, more people on the table are it's going to be more difficult then to come to decisions, especially in a more and more multipolar world where the European Union needs to be active, where it needs to be able to take decisions, and not in a very, very long process, but in a short period of time. So I actually do think there is this dilemma that we don't talk about either side, so no enlargement without treaty change, but also not talking about a treaty change and enlargement. So would you agree that there is this kind of dilemma?
Now, I think actually you can move forward with reforming the European Union without a treaty change. I mean, you can move to qualified majority in all the areas where you want to move to qualified majority without a treaty change, but you need unanimity to move to qualified majority, which makes it a little bit more difficult. And I said before that it's about the political will to change. I mean, the European Commission has never been in charge of joint procurement of vaccines. It was mandated to do so. The European Commission has never been in charge of joint procurement for gas, and is now mandated to discuss these kind of things. So if there's a will, there's a way. That's my point. In particular, in terms of security and defense, we just don't have the time right now, I would say. There's a lot of potential within the treaties which we have not been able to seize. I mean, even in institutional issues, when it comes to the numbers of parliamentarians in the European Parliament, I was the other day in Montenegro, and they have a nice way of seeing those things, because they say, hey, come on, for us joining, you don't need to reform the European Union. We can easily fill the gap that the UK left. Okay, but there's 600,000 versus, 60 million people. They would just take all the parliamentarians that the UK had to return. Okay, so I mean, at least they didn't lose their sense of humor. My point is, there's a lot you can do without putting yourself into the trap of an institutional nitty-gritty discussion where you know that you cannot advance. You better offer good results and convince your people to support you with that, and try to jointly solve the crisis at hand, or at least contribute to solving them, than looking only at the inside of the European Union and opening up a new box of Pandora, where you know that the resistance, in particular of those who are anti-integration, will be very strong.
Yeah. To reverse this argument a bit, why I would not say I disagree with that, but this is something that I've heard repeatedly from French diplomats, that the advantage of enlargement is that you have to modify in some extent the treaty anyway, and their position is more and more, when it comes to a qualified majority of foreign policy decision making, which I think would be also a very important move if EU practically disappears from serious geopolitical discussions on the global scale. Sometimes it's invisible when there is some important conflict happening in the world. And if it wants to present itself at least as a serious foreign policy player as its economy would predict, I think it would be a must. And I think the French position is also that, and I could not tell the exact road how we get there, but if we take a look at the diversity of the European Union at the moment, politically, and Orban, for example, hopes that he will have some more allies, maybe Austria, maybe some other countries but he expects, and right now we really see that there is some progress and development of this Eurosceptic radical right parties, and when you have radical integrationists and you have sovereignists, it's not always that easy to make compromises, and I do think that on the longer run there is just no other way than the multi-speed European Union. It's already in the making to a certain extent, and there is one big difference: Eurozone members versus non-Eurozone members when it comes to economic issues. The latter group discusses much more, but also, also to a certain extent, I think it's Orban's hope as well, and it can be the hope of Eurosceptics that maybe you can live somehow at the periphery of the European Union without being harassed too much about that your institutional system is a bit of undemocratic or does not comply with the standards. You can use all the advantages of free market and so on, but the political dimension of the European Union maybe will be a bit less, I would not say less important, but maybe pulled a bit into the background. And honestly, if we think about integrating countries on the Western Balkans into the European Union, in some issues, maybe Hungary won't be the worst anymore. And it also means that if this geopolitical reality that I otherwise absolutely agree with would dictate that in order that China and Russia does not buy up these countries by pennies, they have to be integrated, or attack them, they have to be integrated in the European Union. But it also means that this new institutional system of the EU has to reflect to a certain extent this greater diversity when it comes to social democratic political traditions.
I agree, but in fact this is very difficult because it increases the complexity of the European Union, which is also which is already a very complex setup, in fact, because we already have a multi-speed Europe in many areas, from Schengen to Euro. And I also think that full access to the single market can in reality only work if you have high rule of law standards. Without rule of law, the single market doesn't work because you need the countries to stick to the rules of the single market. It is not that easy to distinguish between full economic integration and political integration. But yes, we might see a deepening of a multi-speed Europe with some countries advancing more than others. We will see more of that, but that's also something that you can do within the current treaties. For that, you don't need the treaty change.
Thank you. I just would like to pick up on something what Péter also said, what you also said, because you mentioned the Western Balkans, and I do think that Orban has a specific role there. Within the European Union, we talk a lot about Russia's influence. We know since Russia started its war against Ukraine that the European security architecture is more than in crisis. And we do have, you said, enlargement is not only geopolitics. I absolutely agree, but it has been very, very much geopoliticized. But if you look right now and what Hungary's role is, especially in the Western Balkans, I do speak to experts which are dealing for many years in the region, and they say that especially Hungary has an even more destructive role when it comes to the Western Balkans than Russia can always can have. If you consider, for example, that Orban recently visited Bosnia-Herzegovina, Milorad Dodik on January 9th, and if you see that the tendency, of splitting up the country, which is a huge security threat for Bosnia-Herzegovina and the state structure, but also for the whole region. So, and considering that Hungary is a European Union member and a NATO member, many are saying that actually his role is even more destructive than Russia's role could actually be there. What do you think to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I definitely think that Orban's role, practically reaching out to politicians who play a rather destabilizing role in the Western Balkans, and Milorad Dodik is a very visible example for that. Secessionist politicians, usually politicians who have a close relationship already with Putin, and it's like when it comes to relationship with Bosnia-Herzegovina, Orban almost, I would just say almost, but almost only talking to the Republika Srpska, which raises many questions. And when it comes to other countries, for example, North Macedonia, we can also see that Orban's politics, Orban never really builds bilateral ties, but bipersonal and bi-party ties. And he has a strong relationship with VMRO-DPNA, the party of Nikola Gruevski, who still enjoys the hospitality of the Hungarian state, because he came to Hungary as a so-called political fugitive, and Hungary opened its door. Hungarian authorities played a role also to bring him in the country, escaping a judicial procedure. So it's like Hungary plays sometimes a very bizarre role, and definitely not a role that usually, and not a toolkit that EU and NATO member states are playing. Also, if you take into consideration that Hungary have released, and Austria was one of the very few countries that recognized that Hungary released several thousand human smugglers at the middle of a migration crisis that just boosts the whole problem, and it just criminalizes the whole problem, and they use it as a weapon against the European Union, like Lukashenko does, and like
because
Putin
for them the problem is more interesting than the solution to the problem.
Exactly. So there are many questions, but I have to also say that I talked to German colleagues, for example, even a person who is responsible for cooperations in the Western Balkans in the German government, and they said they have a rather good working relationship with the Hungarian government. The Hungarian government in some cases plays a more destabilizing role, but also, Orban, I think usually Orban wants to be there where there is the chaos, where there are the problems, but also he wants to deal with his possible role as a problem solver in certain situations. So it's not that black and white, and I definitely think that Orban overplays his role a bit. Russia is definitely a bigger disruptor and destructor on the Western Balkans than Orban can ever be. And I think it's good to take a look at Orban's activities in the Western Balkans with some suspicion, but it's not that black and white. And I think Orban still has this transactional nature that it's an asset you can buy. He can organize you a good visit with Milorad Dodik. Not sure it will bring along some solutions, but he also plays this big
Who cares, actually? I mean, we do care because we discuss it, but we sometimes over-exaggerate the role that he can actually play in the region, I would say. I mean, we also have 26 other members who play a role in the region. Come on.
Yet not everyone knows that well, the Western Balkans. So I think Orban has his real networks, has his real influence, but
he's not decisive.
Image is stronger
he's not
than
decisive. Yeah.
I think
his image, and that's what he's surfing on, and that's why we talk so much about it. Taking care of his contradictory image as a problem solver or problem maker or as being different is much more important for him than anything else. We could also talk about German influence there, yeah? Even about Austrian influence or other countries that play a role there. I wouldn't give him so much airtime, actually.
Unfortunately, we are already coming to an end, but still I would like to have one more answer to one very important question, because if we talk about the European Union, we rightfully say it has been the biggest peace project within Europe, and this is still the International Institute for Peace. So my question would be very, very briefly, is the European Union a peacemaker, and if yes, in what sense?
I would give a very short response to that. If it is a peacemaker, if it helps to save Ukraine. I'm very pessimistic about that. I think if Ukraine is lost, the whole Western democratic world is becoming increasingly dangerous, because it would reveal its weakness. I'm happy that the US have released funds and weapons to Ukraine. I'm not sure it will be sufficient. The more Europe can step up in the issue of Ukraine, the more it can show that it still has this role of peacemaker, not only within its borders, but also beyond its borders.
I think it is important for the European Union to show its strengths in terms of peacemaking, even if we understand very different things, what that would actually imply. I mean, don't forget, the EU is not a federal state. I mean, the 27 EU member states, they are the ones that pull the strings, in fact. And let's not forget how much the European Union actually tries to do to help. Maybe militarily it is not as strong as the US, of course it is not, but it finances military equipment. Its humanitarian engagement is strong. Its economic help and support is significant. Can it do more? Does it have to do more? Yes, it does. But let's not forget how much it actually does. And I think that's something that also is worth mentioning.
Thank you so much, Paul and Peter. It was a real pleasure for me speaking to you. I think it was very interesting. We touched upon a couple of issues. Obviously, there would be a lot more, but thank you for your time. I hope you also enjoyed the discussion.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thanks for the invitation.
This was the 18th episode of the podcast Peace Matters. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe and stay tuned so that you don't miss our other episodes dealing also with the European Union parliamentary elections.